Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Ayah Ziyadeh, and I'm Americans for Justice in Palestine Action's Advocacy Director. I'm super excited about today's discussion because yesterday, a huge victory for Palestinian rights presented itself within Congress. For one of the first times ever, progressive representatives were successful in getting $1 billion in additional weapons to Israel, stripped from a budget resolution, proving that our voices are being heard and our hard work to fight for Palestinian rights is paying off. With that being said, I'd like to hand over the conversation to our executive director, Dr. Osama Irshaid, to kick off the conversation for us.
Thank you, Josh. I'm very happy to see you again. I just want to put this in perspective, just to understand what we're talking about. We have to remember that we are approaching a hard deadline by September 30th, where our government is facing a potential shutdown. What does this mean? If we have a shutdown, it means that millions of Americans will lose their jobs, millions of Americans will lose their benefits, millions of Americans will continue to suffer and will suffer more because of this shutdown. So this is very essential, very imperative that Congress passes a budget in order to keep our government running and in order to meet our needs, whether as a nation or as people. So there is a continuing resolution to fund the government throughout September, throughout October, throughout November, until December 3rd. Democrats are for this. Republicans are opposed to this. Now, I'm not talking about, and I'm not going to indulge into who's right and who's wrong. I'm not going to indulge into the politics of this. But what we know that the government needs money, the American people need money in order to continue to be able to continue their lives as they're used to it. It is unfortunate that some members of Congress don't have the collective American interest in their minds. It is unfortunate that some members of Congress are willing to play politics with the livelihoods of American people. It is unfortunate that some members of Congress are willing to mortgage the American people's interest on the interest of a foreign nation and a foreign country. The issue now of dispute here is the renewal of the Iron Dome, the Israeli Iron Dome. This is a system to intercept missiles and to intercept rockets, according to the Israelis, to intercept and to defend the Israeli people in southern Israel today, from rockets coming from Gaza. So now we have members of Congress who are saying this is essential. We need to protect our Israeli allies. Good. So we're giving them $1 billion on top of $3.8 billion annually. So it is not the $3.8 billion. It is an extra $1 billion that we're giving them to, again, renew and to maintain and to enhance this Iron Dome that Israel claims it needs to defend its own people. But what no one is talking about is that Israel is the aggressor. Israel is the occupier. Israel is the state that is implementing apartheid, that is enforcing apartheid on the Palestinian people, occupying their lands. Israel is the state that is blockading and besieging the Gaza Strip with over 2 million people for the past almost 15 years now. It is Israel that is engaging and initiating the hostilities and the aggression. And suddenly now Israel becomes the victim, and Israel needs an extra $1 billion to protect its aggression or to enhance its aggression again and strengthen its aggression against the Palestinian people. So let us not confuse what we're dealing with here. We're not talking about humanitarian aid to a state that needs this humanitarian aid. Israel has a very robust economy. It doesn't need our financial aid. Israel can live on its own. without the help of the United States. But Israel takes our $3.8 billion a year, and it wants an extra $1 billion to invest in more weaponry, to invest in more smart or dumb bombs that does not differentiate between a fighter and between a civilian. Israel wants to continue to perpetuate its occupation, to continue to perpetuate the devastation that it's inflicting on the Palestinian people by our taxpayers' money. That's what we're dealing with. So Israel does not really need this. And for members of Congress to condition or to mortgage our collective interests as American people on $1 billion going to Israel, at the expense of American people, at the expense of millions of Americans will go jobless, millions of Americans will lose their benefits, millions of Americans will be evicted from their homes, and millions of Americans, they will lose their health insurances, they will lose whatever social welfare that they need, just to serve a nation that does not respect our laws, that does not respect human rights, that does not abide by international law and international resolutions. That is not acceptable. So what we've seen in the past few days in Congress, that the members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party came out, spoke aggressively against this article, against this itemization to refund or to fund the Iron Dome, and they said we're not going to pass this continuing resolution to continue to fund the government until December 3rd, as long as we're paying for this. Their logic is very clear. They're standing on principle because they are being ethical and moral in their decisions. They are standing on principle in opposing any form of repression, any form of oppression, any form of apartheid, any form of racism. If we oppose this in America, then we should be opposing this globally. And Palestine is no exception. So they are standing on principle, number one. Two, they are prioritizing the American needs. Why can't we pay for, why can't we extend the payments that are made on behalf of American citizens who need this money to pay for their rent, for their leases, to stay in home, not to be evicted? Why can't we pay for this? Why Congress and Republicans are saying that we don't have the money to do it, and we don't have the money to extend leases, and we don't have the money to continue to pay for Medicare or Medicare and Medicare, but now suddenly we have the money to pay a foreign nation that does not need our help, and it's taking our money just to continue its killing and to continue its aggression on a population that is under occupation. So this is what we're dealing with. What happened in the past few days was a victory. Maybe it is not the victory we're looking for. We know that this bill will be reintroduced, or it might be introduced as a standalone bill where some Democrats already establishment Democrats are already talking about reintroducing a standalone bill for the fiscal year 2022, or as part of the appropriation defense bill. We know that it's going to be reintroduced again. We know that many Republicans, or the majority of Republicans and majority of Democrats, will vote for it, and we will know that eventually, most likely, it's going to pass. However, what people need to keep in mind, that this is unprecedented. This is unprecedented. Israel is no longer a consensus issue. Criticizing Israel, calling out Israel for what it is, introducing Israel as it is, as an apartheid regime, introducing Israel as an aggressor, as an occupier, is no longer a political suicide. It is something that is now sanctioned by an overwhelming majority of the American people. No one is really prioritizing Israel anymore when it comes to the public opinions. Our politicians, the majority of our politicians, are still out of touch, or maybe they're engaged in this out of political expediency because they think that they will not be held accountable by mortgaging the Americans people's interest on the interest of a foreign nation. But we will continue our education our awareness campaigns. We will continue our work, and we will double and triple these efforts until the American people will hold their elected officials accountable for what they do. I will conclude with one last thing. A Gallup study in 2017 concluded the following: the more Americans learn about Israel, the less they like it. And the more Americans are aware of these dynamics of being held hostages and our collective interests being held hostages to a foreign nation by officials who claim to represent us, who are elected, who are voted into office by us, the more they learn about this, the more they will hold them accountable. And we will continue this work. So I don't see it as a defeat. I don't see it as a small victory. I see it as part of a larger context where Israel is no longer that consensus issue, and it will never go back to be a consensus issue, because Israel is the aggressor. Israel is not the victim here, and the Palestinians deserve to live in dignity, in liberty, and under a just regime as any other people. They are no different from any minority here in the US when it comes to their rights, and they are no different than any human beings when it comes to their human rights. And we will continue this fight until we make sure that they're afforded their natural rights, the God-given rights, and we will make sure that oppression is defeated, and this is coming soon, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osama, for those very passionate and very insightful remarks. I just want to pick up on some of the points that you touched upon and give for our viewers a little bit more background into what actually took place on Capitol Hill, the significance of what took place on Capitol Hill yesterday, and where do we go from here on this issue of additional supplementary funding of weapons for Israel. So as Dr. Osama mentioned, yesterday we learned in the early morning hours that Majority Leader Steny Hoyer had snuck into this must-pass budget bill $1 billion in additional weapons for Israel. And the vote was coming to the floor of Congress that very afternoon. So there's very, very little time to mobilize. But immediately after everyone heard this really shocking news that this $1 billion, which is a huge appropriation, was just being snuck into the bill at the last moment, phone calls began, emails began, and within a few hours, enough progressive members of Congress told Majority Leader Steny Hoyer that they would not vote for this continuing resolution if it included these weapons to Israel. Now, this is really unprecedented. There has never been a time where members of Congress have proposed putting money for Israel on the table and then taking it off. So this is extremely significant, what happened yesterday. And this is why it's such a huge victory for Palestinian rights. Because this idea of just providing Israel with as much support as it wants, whenever it wants, without any discussion, those days have ended. Those days have ended, and these progressive members of Congress who stood up to this stratagem that Steny Hoyer did yesterday. Do we want to cut to someone else quickly? Ayah, do you want to talk about VPAD?
Yeah, sure, Josh. Looks like we're losing some connection. We have a storm in the area. But as Dr. Osama had mentioned, and Josh, I think this speaks volumes to how much advocacy, how effective advocacy is on the congressional level. A lot of times people just simply do not understand how important it is to have conversations with your Congress members, how much power you have as a constituent. I'm not sure if Josh got to this point or not because of his audio, but a lot of the work that went into yesterday was because of organizations and constituents and people calling Congress members and letting them know that, having $1 more billion going to Israel in the form of weaponry is unacceptable. And that would that cut would not have been possible had there not been any outside conversations happening, had there not been pressure occurring from the outside in, which proves how effective it is to have these conversations, to lobby your Congress members, to text, to call, to send emails, to meet with your Congress members. But before I talk about more advocacy, I'm going to hand it over to Josh again. Hopefully we got him back.
Yeah, I apologize for that audio connection. We're having a storm pass through the region right now. Can you hear me right now? Okay. Okay, we're gonna try it. So let me talk about why this move yesterday was so significant in Congress. In addition to what I mentioned earlier about this being unprecedented, what this really signifies was that progressive members of Congress. All right, I'm afraid I'm going to have to hand it back to Ayah because unfortunately my connection is no good.
Yeah, Josh, maybe, okay. Talking about advocacy, seeing the success of yesterday, as Dr. Osama mentioned, it might not be the biggest victory ever, and we still have a lot of work to do, but it is a form of victory. And goes to show how much the momentum that we've built up in the last few months has proven itself to be successful. But that doesn't mean that we can stop every time there's a minor victory or a minor success. With that being said, Americans for Justice in Palestine Action is holding a advocacy days next week, which will consist of training on how to have conversations and lobby our Congress members, hearing from progressive Congress members and their position in Palestine and what kind of initiatives are going on or how they see Palestinian rights moving through U.S. government from here on out, as well as hearing from activists and organizers, and ending it off with having meetings set for you with your Congress members to talk to them about how important trying to get rid of, the status quo and begin or stop being complicit in Israeli apartheid. I'm going to hand it over to Josh again and see if it'll work this time.
Hopefully this is better now. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Apologies again for that. I just want to set what happened in Congress yesterday in context and talk a little bit more about what comes next on this struggle for additional funds for weapons to Israel. So the Iron Dome, as Dr. Osama mentioned, is a weapon system that is defensive in nature. It is an anti-missile system. And we've seen how Republicans have tried to portray this issue as one of Democrats not supporting the security of Israel. But it's very important to note that Iron Dome is in many ways an offensive weapon in that it enables Israel to go on the attack against Palestinians, having an effective deterrent and defense, and knowing that their attacks against Palestinians will be virtually cost-free. So when we hear from Republicans that this is a defensive weapon that is solely designed to protect Israeli civilians, that's really only half of the story. What it's meant to do is to make Israel's ongoing illegal blockade and siege of the Gaza Strip more easy and effective for Israel to maintain, with ever greater devastating impact upon Palestinian civilians who are on the receiving end of Israel's much more sophisticated, much more advanced arsenal of U.S. weapons. So Iron Dome, while it does effectively prevent Israeli civilians from being harmed by incoming rocket fire, Palestinians on the other side have no effective defense whatsoever against the much more devastating U.S. weapons in Israel's arsenal. So not only do we provide Israel with the weapons that they need to protect their citizens, but we also provide Israel with the much more devastating weapons that they need to continue to oppress the Palestinian people, especially in the besieged and beleaguered Gaza Strip. And so we see this continued imbalance also in the way that Congress chooses what issues it will decide to take up. So while there's no problem at all with Majority Leader Steny Hoyer trying to rush forward $1 billion in additional weapons to Israel, on the other hand, as we speak right now, Congress is debating what's called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced an amendment to this bill that would block the delivery of what are called joint direct attack munitions to Israel. These were the same exact weapons that killed entire Palestinian families in Gaza in May. And the Rules Committee said that her amendment was out of order and that it would not be considered. So while we suddenly have $1 billion extra lying around to give more weapons to Israel, we cannot even consider in Congress an amendment to a bill that would just put a halt to the delivery of one particular devastating weapon to Israel. So while we can talk about what happened yesterday as a victory for Palestinian rights in Congress, which it definitely was, we also have to ensure that we keep in mind that there is a continuing imbalance and that we are still a long, long way from achieving Palestinian rights in Congress. And as Dr. Osama mentioned, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer pledged on the floor of Congress last night to bring back this funding for Israel in what's called a standalone bill, meaning that it would be a bill all in of itself devoted to funding this $1 billion in weapons for Israel by the end of this week. And it will, unfortunately, undoubtedly pass, because unfortunately there are very few Democrats who will go out on a limb on a recorded vote and say, no, I don't think we should be giving Israel even more weapons. We have to keep in mind that the United States gives Israel more weapons at taxpayer expense than all other countries in the world combined. That makes us complicit in Israel's human rights atrocities against the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, there are very few, it's true, who as of now will stand up and say, no, no more. But we are building that momentum. So as we continue to fight this additional $1 billion in weapons to Israel, we know that this is only the beginning. We know that we need to continue to build our political power, to build the momentum, to build support for efforts like Representative Betty McCollum's bill, which would restrict how Israel uses weapons in some instances. We need to build political support for the idea of withholding money to Israel, conditioning money to Israel, and finally ending all forms of U.S. assistance to Israel until it ends its brutal regime of apartheid and settler colonialism against the Palestinian people. So the struggle is ongoing. Stay tuned for an upcoming action alert from AJP Action about how you can get involved in this ongoing struggle to prevent these additional weapons from going to Israel.
Thank you, Josh. As you mentioned, thank you for all the strong points. I think it's often very easy to get caught up in the fact that things aren't moving fast enough, but I think that this past year proves how much our work has come into effect. 10 years ago, there weren't any progressives standing in the face of a budget like this, or being bold enough to go up and strip it. And I think that speaks a lot to our advocacy work, us as Americans within the US advocating for Palestinian rights on the ground all the time. And AJP Action urges you to sign up for our virtual advocacy days next week and continue this momentum. Use your rights, use your voice, talk to your Congress members. You can sign up at ajpaction.com. Also follow us on social media, AJP Action everywhere. Sign up for our newsletter in order to continue getting action alerts for us, making it really easy for you to continue advocating for Palestinian rights. No matter how far we go, we have to keep going. We have a long way to go, but we're certainly getting there. So thank you so much for being here today. And don't forget to register for our virtual advocacy days happening next week. Our deadline is on Friday morning. So be sure to register ASAP, and this year's registration is free. And you can also, it's going to be virtual, so you'll have the comfort of doing it from anywhere in the US. So be sure to register as soon as you can. And thank you for tuning in.